Hello there, my name is Thomas and welcome to this latest episode of British Culture Albion Never Dies. This is of course the Alphabet of Britishness. H is for, oh gosh, so many things. I didn't even ask people this time. I often ask people in the Facebook group, Britain, people, places and pastimes. I normally ask on Instagram. But this time I was flooded, and it's fascinating how some letters of the alphabet there seems to be so much, and some so little, but this time I hesitate to say overwhelmed, but close to it. That's why I didn't ask anyone. But lots of people have been really, really helpful, and I'll be shouting out to each of them. And there's been some other people helping me with interviews. I've been very, very lucky. Two published authors, my friend Kane, and a very well-known member of the Bond community have been in touch with me and helped me out. And there's some great interview content coming up at some point in the future. 4 fantastic episodes are in the can, waiting for their moment to be broadcast. So for now, I'm keeping to the schedule of the Alphabet of Britishness. I'm not throwing out all these interviews all at once, but they are coming up. There's a lot to look forward to on this channel and on the YouTube channel that I've been working away on. Thank you very much for everyone who's been commenting on the videos, liking the videos, subscribing and so on, all the good stuff. Thank you very, very much. It's very helpful, and it's great just to have those conversations on a new platform. It's hard to comment on a podcast, right? But it's very, very easy to comment on YouTube. And not everyone does it. I don't comment on all the YouTube videos I watch, but I really, really appreciate those who do comment. It gets the conversations going. So I have to say, first of all, thank you very much to the gentleman called Mark in Bulgaria who messaged me by my email and wrote a lovely, lovely email telling me which episodes he enjoys, especially deep dives with Kane. And as I say, he'll be on in the near future. As I say, we've recorded an episode together. It's a lot. It's a mammoth episode, but we will be going through it. If I can quote the email, he said, Kane is a person with seemingly endless knowledge on British culture. The episodes on tea and on men's clothing of particular interest. Yeah, I totally agree. He's not just because he's a really good friend, but he's helped me so much with this. And as I say, he's helping me more. There's more good stuff with Kane coming. And thank you very much to my friend Ian in Shenzhen, who was correcting me actually with the previous episode where I talked about Wallace and Gromit. G is for Gromit, I think I said, and I may have referenced them as being from Yorkshire. In fact, they're supposed to be from Lancashire. It's the voice actor Peter Sallis who plays Wallace, who's from Yorkshire, and that's why I associate it with Yorkshire. But Nick Park is from Lancashire. So there we go, we get the Tudor Rose with Yorkshire and Lancashire combined. I really appreciate it. As I say, I've mentioned previous corrections. I think Pete Brooker from Tailors of Love messaged me about cricket bats, the anatomy of, the cricket wicket and so on. And it's really helpful for me. I've spent a long time living abroad, and it's easy for me to forget these things, to get these things wrong, and that's partly why I'm doing this podcast, is really just to sort out in my own mind what is Britishness and where does this come from. And again, I had ideas about H, ideas which people didn't message, so I might mention at the end what they were if I remember to do it. But as I say, all of these, every single one of these topics is something that somebody else suggested, and I find that so interesting. This is like a huge survey of what do you think. And I'll be mentioning, as I say, quite a few different topics. There were a few people who were suggesting H is for Henry, because we've had quite a few Henrys. I mean, we've obviously had Henry VIII. Henry VIII is pretty famous. He's often portrayed in film and TV and theatre. There's songs about him. He's a very well-known king, but of course having a Henry VIII implies that there were 7 other Henrys. And as I say, it's a name with a lot of kings, and so I spent a lot of this week looking into them. Of course, I'm not a historian. I must stress that there are serious, legitimate historians out there, but I touch on these things on this podcast, as I say, as people request. So for example, I might touch on HP Source. H is for HP Source. Jocelyn Sai, Ladies Who Bond on Instagram, was suggesting that H is for HP Source, and I quite like that. I immediately pulled out some HP Source from the fridge and showed it to on a call and said, hey, look, I even have it in my fridge at all times. I used to live in Shenzhen in China, where I couldn't get it. I actually used to travel down to Hong Kong to buy it and take it back, and now getting it from the exotic food shops in America. It is essentially, for American listeners, the same as A1 steak sauce, and we're used in the same way, but it's House of Parliament sauce. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. I love to have it with a cooked breakfast. But as I say, Ian in Shenzhen, I think, was the first person to message me about this idea of doing all the King's Henry, or Harry, or Henri. So we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them so far. So I'll dive into it. I'm just going to give a quick overview of all 8, and then I'll give each of them their due. So the first King Henry was crowned in the year 1100 or 1100, as you prefer, and ruled until 1135. A good 35-year reign there, not bad. Henry II from 1154 to 1189, and he's best known for the Thomas Beckett controversy. In fact, I'd say more people have probably heard of Thomas Beckett than Henry II, that being the biggest controversy of his life. Potentially, there's one other that might rival it, which I'll get into in a moment. Henry III came king at 9 years old. He's the son of King John, so again, King John's probably better known than Henry III. That's 1216 to 1272. I'm saying they're the dates of their reign, rather than the dates of their birth, because I feel that's the most important thing for us when we're studying them. We're studying them as kings, you know. Henry IV, the first king since 1066 to be a native English speaker. Possibly gave the first kind of big public addresses in English from a king. There's 2 Shakespeare plays about him, so if Henry IV sounds familiar, well, part 1, part 2, you know, it's a big Shakespeare play. Henry V, probably one of the most famous of the Shakespeare histories. He's been played by Laurence Olivier, Richard Burton, Timothy Dalton, Kenneth Branagh, Jude Law, Tom Hiddleston. All the top British Shakespearean actors have had a bash at Henry V, and he's been shown in very different lights throughout the past decades, centuries even. Henry VI, okay, a few more Shakespeare plays. Again, this depends heavily on how much you enjoy your Shakespeare histories. I personally enjoy the histories more than most of the other Shakespeare plays. He again was king at 9 months old, the only English monarch to have also been crowned King of France, which of course went awry. The 7th, when I read through all 8 kings, to be honest, the 7th is the one that grabbed my attention the most, and so I've done the most reading of him. And if I buy a book on any of the 8 Henrys, I'll probably buy a book on Henry VII, the first Tudor king. And then, of course, Henry VIII is too famous. So I won't be going into Henry VIII very much, because there's loads and loads and loads of good stuff out there that's so easy to find, and as I say, it's from serious, qualified, legit historians. So this is just a quick run through of who are all these Henrys. So I proceed chronologically. Henry I, 5th of August, the year 1100, was when he became king, and he became known as Henry Beauclerk because he was a good king and a good organiser. He was said to be harsh but effective, which always makes me think of the Monty Python sketch where they have a gangster who dies and they say, well, this is a cruel man, desperately cruel, but very fair. Once nailed my head to the floor. Don't know why, but I'm sure he had his reasons. Anyway, he was said to be harsh but effective. He is a king who... he's interesting for what he sets up. So, unfortunately, his son, William, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, which threw the royal succession to doubt. He didn't have a son to succeed him, so he named his daughter Matilda as monarch. And I know I referenced this once before, the time known as the Anarchy. He wanted his daughter to be queen in her own right. His nephew Stephen tried to take over, and we ended up with a period of absolute civil war known as the Anarchy. And this is the time that the Cad File Chronicles is set, which is a very, very successful series of historical novels. I thought broadly, mostly thought to be historically very, very plausible. Cad File himself is fictitious, but his experience, his life, it all seems to be very plausible. As I said, it was written by a very, very serious academic. It was a great TV show with, I think, Derek Jacobi. if I'm wrong, correct me, and I'll read it out at the beginning of the next podcast. I think it was him. And again, this period of anarchy I find fascinating, also particularly because he wanted his daughter to be monarch in her own right. I say, what a civil war that led to. It's not often touched upon, I feel, in our mainstream history, but it is an interesting what if we could have had a female ruler that early. And as I say, it's interesting because it's the background of the Cad File Chronicles. So Henry I, as I say, he's an interesting fella. Centralised power, very, very organised, but succeeded by, literally, anarchy. And a very violent anarchy. Henry II, I'm going to skip over a bit of history there. Henry II, ruler from 1154 to 1189. Good innings as king, but best known for the Thomas Beckett controversy. So the power of the church was enormous in the early medieval era. He had a clash with Thomas Beckett, senior clergyman. This was really, really well covered in the TV show A History of Britain by Simon Sharma. Came out many, many years ago. It's been circulating around on various channels ever since, but it always seems to be current somewhere. I thought he dealt with the early medieval era very, very well. And it was really, this conflict was really about the rights and privileges of the church. And the king's exact words has been debated ever since. It's been dramatised. I think the one that sticks with me is, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? But I know that some people say that's not the most historically accurate, but there's a lot of different versions going on. Anyway, this leads to the murder of Thomas Beckett in Canterbury Cathedral, and very soon after his death, Thomas Beckett was canonised by Pope Alexander III. So this is a huge event which has the king having to pay public penance for his sin of crying out against this man, and knights being banished and having to go to Rome to seek forgiveness, and being sent to the Holy Lands to serve there. But really, Henry II is remembered for his close family conflict. So as mentioned, this is probably the biggest conflict that gets talked about, but there's also the Revolt of 1173 to 1174, which is a rebellion against King Henry II by 3 of his sons and his wife, and their rebel supporters. And among those rebels was the future Richard the Lionheart and King John. So his own 2 sons who would succeed him as king, and his own wife rebelling against him. So these family feuds, and these feuds with very, very close friends, he had been close friends with Thomas Beckett, really sort of shape our idea of him. There's a 1966 play called The Lion in Winter, which is based on him, set at Christmas 1183, so 10 years after the Great Rebellion. Most awkward family Christmas ever, as the king meets with his kind of estranged wife and his children and so on. It is fictitious, and the writers said, this is made up, I know, because I made it up. But as I say, this is what most people find most interesting about Henry II, is that he tried to rule through close friends and close family, and those dramas, they were intense. What can I say? Okay, Henry III. Right. He's one of those kings who, again, is probably more interesting for what happened afterwards or because of him than what happened during his reign, although you're free to disagree. These are my own personal opinions. Of course they are. It's my podcast. They're helped by so many other people with their great ideas. Anyway, Henry III started to be king in 1216 at the age of 9 years old. He's the son of King John, bad King John, who people rebelled against, got him to sign the Magna Carta. And Henry III kind of astonishingly signs up to it. So in theory, the Magna Carta was really not supposed to be the foundation of any kind of constitution. It's the closest thing England has to a constitution, but it has become the foundation of a constitution, often perhaps because Henry III accepted it, and then subsequent kings accepted it. But his rule was dominated by rebellions of knights and barons. One of the most radical barons was Simon de Montfort, who seized power in 1263, and fought against the king at the Battle of Lewes in 1264, where Henry III was defeated and taken prisoner. So this king famously was imprisoned with his son, as the knights ruled the land in their own right. Henry's eldest son Edward escaped from captivity, defeated Montfort at the Battle of Evesham, freed his father, and his son was Edward I, who was a great and terrible king. So I find Edward I deeply, deeply fascinating, and some people would look at his father as being pious but weak. And weakness, Edward I may have had many, many flaws, but weakness was certainly not one of them. So that complete change, really, between the two of them, between Henry III, the barons literally ran the land without him, imprisoning him, and Edward I, who defeated the barons, conquered Wales, hammered Scotland. I mean, a very, very different person. So again, Henry III, in some ways, interesting for what he sets up. Henry IV, again, we skip forward in time. We actually skip forward quite some time, until 1399. So in 1399, we have Henry IV. He rallied a group of supporters, overthrew and imprisoned Henry II, and I realise just by saying that I am spoiling 2 Shakespeare plays, which are really focused on Henry Bolingbroke, or Henry IV. So again, he's a king who's a native English speaker, fascinating stuff. And again, there's 2 Shakespeare plays about him, as of course he overthrew, and if you overthrow a king, then naturally there's people who are like, well, if you overthrew the king and now you're king, how about if I overthrow you? Simple stuff, really, but enough to fill a couple of plays. And of course, Henry V, I mean, infamous, one of the most famous Henrys, if not more famous than Henry VIII, perhaps. Again, the litany of stars that have portrayed him. Again, Laurence Olivier, Richard Burton, Tom Hiddleston recently, Timothy Dalton. I like the Kenneth Branagh version, but I think that's a fabulous, fabulous film. And it draws on the previous 2 history plays, as Henry V ponders whether a son is responsible for the sins of his father. It is a fascinating kind of take, I think, Kenneth Branagh's. There have been more recent ones. I'm going to skip over again because I feel it's so well known that I should scarcely be covering it here, because it's so easy to find a version of Henry V. Henry VI, perhaps a bit lesser known, he is the son. And sadly, since the untimely death of Henry V, he became king at 9 months old. The only English monarch to have also been crowned King of France, which of course was land that he lost, although one can hardly blame him, he was an infant. And again, if I've referenced Shakespeare plays, Henry IV gets 2 Shakespeare plays, Henry V gets 1, Henry VI gets 3. He does very well out of Shakespeare. Part 1 dealing with the loss of England's French territories, and the political kind of consequences of that lead up to the internal tensions within England, as the 100 Years' War ends and the War of the Roses, the internal civil war, begins. The English political system just gets torn apart by all the personal squabbles, jealousy. I guess it's the blame game going very, very out of control. So Henry VI, Part 2, effectively shows the king's inability to stop this, the inevitability of the conflict that's coming, and then Part 3 is just the horror that is the War of the Roses, and it is a desperate, desperate, bloody time. Henry VII, well, he's the first Tudor king, so he ends the War of the Roses, he ends that civil war. And again, I just have to say, I just started with Wikipedia, and then I go through all the references, and then I just see, where does it go? I look on, YouTube, I just Google it. That's all I'm doing. And I have to say, I had the best time looking at Henry VII. I feel in some ways, just looking at a painting of him, for me, he looks like a quiet, cunning man, and virtually every description of him is that he was a very, very quiet, very cunning man, and he is a man who came to the throne at such a time of turbulence that he was incredibly clever in the way he was able to, line up everyone else's interests with his own to make sure that he ended up being king of a very, very peaceful time. He was able to hand over, when his own early reign had been so in question, he was able to make the authority of the king really beyond question. And of course, I think very highly of him because he invested in the Royal Navy, which of course was set up by Alfred the Great, but then in the Tudor era started to get greater and greater investments. I think it was Henry VII who created what is now the world's oldest dry dock. Again, an interesting man, but I feel that the more I say about him, the more I'm taking away from your own internet rabbit holes, wherever they may lead. And I have to say, Henry VII is a really good place to start an internet rabbit hole. What can I say about Henry VIII that isn't blindingly obvious? Well, became king in 1509, died in 1547, again, a very good innings, perhaps most famous for his numerous wives, and again, quite the contrast from his father, who, as far as we know, was monogamous. Medieval kings weren't always. They had quite a few mistresses, and in fact, Henry VIII and VII partly were descended, part of their royal descent was from an illegitimate child, which became legitimised later on. Now, Henry VIII did have a son, an illegitimate son, called Henry, who Henry VIII tried to legitimise, started giving titles, more and more titles, and actually really followed through, really trying to make his son, Henry, be king after him. So again, all these wives, all this sort of story that's so famous, his wives are divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, partly in his hunt to try and have a son. But as I say, he had an illegitimate son. He followed through with some of his forebears' techniques of trying to legitimise this son, but who sadly died of respiratory illness. But we nearly had a Henry IX. There is no Henry IX in English history, but we were very, very nearly there. And of course, his daughters have really become more famous than the son who succeeded him, but again was a boy king. But I've referenced that in previous episodes, and I'll be referencing a lot of this Tudor history in a very, very short while, in November. Something to look forward to. So those are really the 8 Henrys, and that's been it's been the majority of the runtime of this podcast. So I think H will probably have to be for 8 Henrys, but not necessarily Henry VIII. I wanted to touch on some of the other ones who were perhaps not so well known, but jolly interesting. And someone messaged me and said, "Hey, I want you to do Henry VIII. Actually, if there's an 8th, there's probably 7 others Henrys that you can do, but I just don't know about them." So I hope at the end now you have an idea of who these people are. And as I say, if I was to Google one of them, if I was to carry on doing Henry research, for me it would be the 7th. He seems canny and interesting. Okay, the headline topic is sometimes the one that gets the most votes. So this one comes very, very close, because Ian in Shenzhen, and friend of the podcast, Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches, who, funnily enough, has just been on Quantum of History, talking about Goldfinger, the book versus the film. That was a really, really cool episode. But these two gentlemen both suggested H is for Harrods. I've referenced Harrods before. It is, of course, was for a long time the world's most expensive store. Of course, right in the heart of London. It is, I don't know, it's a bit of a tourist attraction. I've been round at Christmas just to look at their Christmas displays, and no intention of buying anything from them, but it's fascinating to look around. What I was sorry to miss was that they no longer sell exotic animals. Like for much of their history, they had a baby elephant in the shop at all times, just to prove that you can buy anything in the world from Harrods. The department store's Pet Kingdom opened up back in 1917, selling tigers and panthers, and as I say, the baby elephant was for a long time the icon of Harrods, or as Ali G called it, Arrods. And even had the bag made up, so it was apostrophe ARRODS. So yeah, during part of this trade, I think a baby elephant was sold to Ronald Reagan back when he was governor of California, so he got a Harrods elephant. Noel Coward, He once got an alligator one Christmas, but I think the most well-known one is Christian the Lion. So he was purchased by 2 Australian backpackers, John Rendell and his friend Ace Burke in 1969. I don't know if Ace is the real name, but he's known as Ace Burke. And fortunately for Lion, he was released back into the world by conservationist George Adamson. So I looked up on YouTube the Born Free Foundation. They have a video on YouTube where Christian the Lion has been released. He's been living with other lions happily in the wild. But these 2 Australian backpackers, they come along to see now this full-grown lion. And this full-grown lion runs at them and embraces them in a big hug, clearly remembering who they are. And it's a wonderful, wonderful video. As I say, it's on YouTube, the Born Free Foundation, Christian the Lion. Anyway, this practice of selling exotic animals, of course, ended when we introduced the Endangered Species Act in 1976, stopping this kind of free and fair trade, or free trade anyway, in animals. So H could be for Arods. I was surprised how few people messaged me to say H is for Harry Potter. I guess it is a very, very modern representation of Britain in the world. It's certainly an experience of many Brits that they open their mouths and people say, gosh, you speak just like Harry Potter. Yeah, I guess that's got a huge cultural weight. I feel reluctant to speak on it. I'm not a Harry Potter expert. I have been to that train station a couple of times when it was first set up and they had the trolley half buried in the wall, but it was somewhere hidden around. I think it's King's Cross. I'm such a lightweight on this topic. I should have Googled something. I've literally been there and I'm struggling to remember, but I know that if you go there now, there's a huge shop and there's professional photographers. And actually I arrived more than an hour early for a train, so I thought I'd queue up, and I was queuing for over an hour. I scarcely caught my train. It was fun. You can have your Harry Potter photo taken there. Just to say on films, Mr. Spies in Ties on Instagram, he was suggesting H is for Hammer Film Productions. I must admit, I thought Hammer Films, I thought Hammer Horror. Surely they just produced horror. So I had a look on the Hammer film website, and their fun fact is that only 1/3 of Hammer films are actually horror. So they do tackle other genres, psychological thrillers, sci-fi, noir. It's fun to look through their old movie posters, like from the 50s. They've got noir films like Man Bait and Bad Blonde and Terror Street. And they are, of course, going in more recent times. So they produced Woman in Black, starring Daniel Radcliffe, who, of course, was Harry Potter. But as I say, I think of Hammer, I think horror. And I have to say, I do think Christopher Lee, I went on their website, this huge banner with a big picture of Christopher Lee, of course, who is Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun, or he is Saruman from Lord of the Rings, or he's Count Dooku, or he's Sherlock Holmes, or he's whatever you've seen him in. I think when he was alive, he had the title, he'd been in more films than any other actor living. And I think he still has that title, unless you kind of go right back to the early days of film, in which, films were 5 minutes long, and so people appeared in hundreds and hundreds. But I think he's still the title of someone who's appeared in more feature films than any other actor. Okay, going back again, Ian in Shenzhen was on it with the suggestions for H, and suggested Horatio Nelson. This is one of those topics where I'm going to say right now, I feel I should do a deep dive on this later. I don't know what the next deep dive will be, but as I say, I'm sitting on a bunch of great content at the moment that I'm going to be throwing out. So at some point I might get to this. Nelson is, of course, a huge hero in the UK. Royal Navy commander at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Defeated Napoleon's plans twice at the Battle of the Nile and the Battle of Trafalgar. His heroic death rarely secures his position as one of Britain's most heroic figures, and his column still towers above. Nelson's column, what can I say? His signal just prior to the commencement of the Battle of Trafalgar is still the stuff of legend, and also the stuff of, I'd say, great confusion. What exactly did the HMS Victory signal all the other ships? Excuse me. I'm not cutting that out. I think a lot of people say England expects that every man will do his duty. But it has been paraphrased quite a lot. And so some people take it with very different things. What is it? England expects every man to do his duty. For England expects. I think that the this, the that, the to do, England expects every man must do his duty. It seems to be the most questioned quote and the most misquoted quote in our history, except perhaps as he lay dying, he said, what did he say? Did he say to Mr. Hardy, "Kiss me"? Or did he say "kismet"? So lots of people like to say that he said to his dear friend, "Kiss me, Hardy." But I've always assumed that he actually said kismet, which is Arabic for fate or luck. I've always gone for kismet since he spent, he's a naval man, he was well travelled, and of course he fought in the Battle of the Nile. He obviously came across Arabic. It's the more sanguine thing to say. "Kiss me, Hardy," though, has become a very, very popular quote. I'm getting towards the end of the list. Haggis, Ian and Shenzhen. Oh, haggis is a good one. It's fascinating. I haven't really celebrated Burns Night in the UK, but I've celebrated in a lot of expat communities. It seems when we travel, for some reason, living in another country makes us celebrate the Scottish poet very, very much, and often haggis is a part of the Burns Night celebration. It's of course a sheep's stomach stuffed with meat and oats, and has the popular sauce, whiskey, poured upon it. So I celebrated this in Oman. In Oman, some British expatriates gave the recipe to an Indian chef who looked through the list, understood, went off, created this dish, gave it to us. It was curried, and he said, "But sir, you didn't include any spices, so I just included my own." And actually, it was really, really good. So in Oman, there is this kind of tradition of curried haggis, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's what you get when two cultures collide. And I have to say, I have at times been asked, normally by older fellas, if I want to go on a haggis hunt. And I'm told that a haggis is a creature that lives in the hills of Scotland, and so that it can be even on the hills, then it's got one leg shorter than the other, and so you run after it and you try and shoo it down onto the flats, and then because one leg is shorter than the other, it goes round and round and round in circles. So if someone invites you on a haggis hunt, they just want to go round and round in a circle. I don't know where this story came from, but I've been told this by a few random, completely unconnected people in different parts of the world. Oh, he's sending you on a haggis hunt. It seems to be an expression, but I'm not sure how well known it is. Something else, staying on the topic of I'm not sure how well known this is Harvest Festival. So of course in America people have Thanksgiving, but in Britain, of course we don't have Thanksgiving, but Harvest Festival is around the same time. It is a religious festival. It is giving thanks for a harvest, but it's also often a helping others festival, so you send food to those who are very much in need. So I remember when I was young, it was kind of sending tin foods to the Balkans and so on. And I've talked to a few different Brits, and some have really strong memories of this being huge, and some just say, nope, never heard of it. So it could be regional. Again, it's very rural, definitely a rural festival, and it's also a very religious festival. So if you're living in a place where it's big and you're not part of that religious community, maybe you're not aware of it. But I think Harvest Festival is a very interesting one. Hot cross buns. I don't know if we claim that exclusively. I don't know how much of a British thing this is compared to a Christian thing generally. But of course, a hot cross bun is the bun you have around Easter, which is symbolic of the Christian faith. So every bun is decorated with a cross made from flour paste, which represents the cross on which Jesus died. And there's spices, which are said to represent the spices that are used to embalm Christ after his death. So H could be for hot cross bun. H could be for high tea. And I shall refer you to the deep dive into tea, which was Kane and myself, which was a really good episode. Even if I say so myself, and I do find myself going back to that episode a lot. So again, these were from Ian in Shenzhen, so thank you very much, Ian. Again, two fellas, Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches, and Kane in Fuzhou, talked about Hastings. So yeah, the Battle of Hastings was of course this huge turning point in history, where you go from people in England being very much a Germanic people to having kind of Norman French rulers. And then we get this strange combination of Germanic language and French language in creating what we now think of as modern English. And it's astonishing what a momentous occasion this is. We look at all of history before, we look at all of history afterwards. There's no doubt this is a turning point in history. And it's amazing how little we know. Like, one of our key sources is simply an embroidery, commonly referred to as the Biotapestry. It's not technically a tapestry, it's an embroidery, but it is a fascinating document. Particularly interesting because there's so many actually mysteries within it, and it's also interesting for what it doesn't contain. There's large, important events that are kind of just cut out because it's history really seen from the victor's point of view. And it just cuts out the Saxon battles against the Vikings that were huge in that era and huge in that year. But as I say, they're not included, and we only get them from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which are chronicles by the monks at the time. Which, again, the copies we have now are kind of copies of copies of copies. So we're not sure, in some cases, what was interlined when. So we really have kind of one source, then, one source which is a tapestry, one written source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. There are a few historians who are writing later. They refer to sources that have long since been lost. But the Biotapestry, kind of the Norman conquest, 1066, this is a huge piece of English history. And perhaps what's interesting is that in the modern day, especially with the internet and so on, you can go to the original sources. And as I said, there's a few mysteries in the Biotapestry. My favourite one is that there's very, very few people named in the tapestry, and they're basically kings. They are brothers of a king who were extremely important at the time. A guy called Thorold, who we have no idea who he is, not referenced in anything else. He's portrayed in a very small character, which suggests that he was unimportant. And there's as many academic papers suggesting his identity as you like. Maybe he was the artist. Maybe he was a court jester. Maybe he was a well-known conjurer or sorcerer. Maybe nobody knows what he was. He's obviously important to the tapestry makers because he's named, and yet he seems to be unimportant because he's like a third of the size of everybody else, and that's traditionally how they showed someone's importance or unimportance. It's quite bizarre. You could ask what's on the top and bottom of the tapestry, because at some points they are images from the fables of Aesop, and they seem to be allegories that match what's happening. At other times, there's no matching of what's happening, and sometimes it just seems to be random decoration. So what's going on there with the borders? Why? Just why? So there's a lot of mysteries around the Battle of Hastings, including, of course, where is it? We assume it's near Hastings. Where the exact battle is, I mean, some people say it isn't actually at Hastings, there's a place called Battle. So we don't exactly know where it is. So the Battle of Hastings, full of mystery, but definitely full of importance. Okay, and finally, Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches had one very special request, which is that I should look up Holbeach. So Holbeach is a quaint Lincolnshire village where his ancestors purportedly came from, and I looked it up, and the more I looked, the more frankly normal it looked. It's just a nice little English village or a nice English town, the kind of place where most people live. Like, most of UK media focuses on London. I'd say our films, our TV show are really London centric, which is funny to me. I've never lived in London. I've been there, I've seen it, but to be honest, I've been as much of a tourist there as people travelling from all over the world. So it's funny that so much of our media represents, and perhaps it's the same for America. I look at American films, I see New York, maybe bits of California, and lovely, I'm in California now, so I'm kind of sometimes looking and thinking, gosh, this looks like somewhere the A-Team might drive down. But again, media focuses on these small production centres, but most people don't live there, of course not. So Holbeach looked like a very ordinary place, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's like the kind of place I might live. So, I'll perhaps reveal one thing that's coming up. Kane and I had a really, really good long talk about Britain being not just London. We really wanted to explore just all the other places you can go. It's an interesting country, and what can I say? I've got a whole podcast about British culture, so it's coming. I'd say it's a monster of an episode, so brace yourselves for it. But it is good, and as I say, I'll get into places like Holbeach very, very soon. So that is the end. That is the final topic thank you to everybody who messaged me. As I didn't even have to ask for any of these topics. You just gave them to me, so thank you. And I've got to say, H, if it stands for anything, is definitely for Henry, 8 of them, but not just Henry VIII. Thank you very, very much for listening, and stay tuned for more content coming soon, both on this podcast and on my YouTube. Thank you.